Social fact and value. There appears to be increasing convergence over the understanding of social value and the strong likelihood that this term will become more common in discussions and practice around public sector, commissioning and procurement. This will be mainly due to likely incorporation into policy and law in 2012 of the Private Members Bill, Public Services or Social Value. The widening understanding of social value will be along the lines of the additional environmental, social and economic benefits that can be accrued to communities above and beyond the delivery of the service. These kinds of benefits or additional value might come, for example, from sourcing food locally with impacts both on local employment and environment, reducing crime, increasing community structure, involving local apprentices who were previously unemployed in a local area, enabling skill development and increased employability. More information on the progress of the bill and its implications can be found on a NACVA website. Smaller charities and local support and development organizations will need to keep up to date with how such requirements will be factored into practical local commissioning. At the moment, it is unclear what will be the most appropriate ways for organizations to think about, choose, and evidence these wider benefits. It is also unclear how commissioners will incorporate ways of measuring progress or achievement of such objectives within contracts, grants, or strategic planning, or of how best to determine what is possible within initial pre-commissioning processes. Basic measurement concepts. Whilst you may already be clear, it is first useful to get to grips or to remind yourself of the main concepts that underpin many measurement approaches and discussions. The words that are particularly used in current discussions of social value are inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. Inputs. This refers to all the resources that you have or will need to accomplish particular goals. These resources might be, for example, people, physical assets, equipment, money, or time. Activities. These are the things you do to create change for people, your local area, or the environment. Examples might be training, events, or information leaflets. Outputs refer to the direct results of these activities. For example, 100 people have achieved a particular qualification or 1,000 information brochures were delivered in a local area. Outcomes. Outcomes are generally changes in people, the environment, or the community that result from your activities. For example, this might be becoming more employable or reducing crime in an area. Outcomes can also refer to keeping situations the same or preventing something negative from happening. Intermediate outcomes can be a useful way to describe step changes that happen along the way to a final outcome or impact. Impacts. These are the longer-term changes that you are trying to achieve or contribute to. They take account of what would have happened anyway, the contribution of others, and the length of time it takes for the outcomes to happen. Impacts often relate to a wider user group than that which are targeting and usually involve other players, for example, in reducing teenage pregnancies. As a result, most reporting tends to be for outcomes, although there are often attempts to recognize and account for external influences on your results. It is important not to overstate your role in creating particular outcomes or impacts. There are ways of talking about the relationship of what you do to the wider environment. For example, the term attribution can be used to refer to how much of a particular change or outcome is attributable to or because of your actions. Dead weight is another important term that is often used by government. It means what might have happened if you had done nothing at all. For example, out of a group of 50 people, a certain percentage is likely to have got a job, whatever you did. Displacement is also important. For example, if you are promoting small businesses in a particular area by setting up a managed workspace, have you really just moved economic activity from one place to another? Drop-off is a term that reflects the extent of deterioration of an outcome over time. Theory of change, or understanding and communicating how you do things. An important issue to recognize is that the ideas and concepts above refer primarily to external impacts and outcomes. They do not focus on how things happen, only if they have. Obviously, understanding how your resources and activities create outcomes is important to knowing how to improve what you do and explaining how you create the changes that you claim. This is important for replicating activities, improving what you do, or convincing funders and commissioners. One way to look at this issue, through a method which appears to be widely promoted, is through developing a theory of change. This is a process by which you can articulate how the resources and activities you do create change. It requires you to consider very carefully the strategies and assumptions you are making. This can sometimes be quite difficult or surprising, but can lead to positive changes or improvements in what you do. A core dimension of working out your theory of change is to use stakeholders, in other words, the different groups of people who benefit from or who are impacted by your activities. It is often only by asking all those affected or who might be doing similar projects that you can often determine unintended consequences or wider outcomes and throw more light on how things might be happening. There are several ways in which you could develop a theory of change. Linear models. Theory of change requires you to consider very carefully the strategies and assumptions you are making. One of the simplest and in some senses the most simplistic is that of the linear logic model or impact map. These approaches can help you identify the assumptions you are making and test these out with stakeholders. These assumptions could, for example, relate to how your activities link to your outcomes and the range of contextual or environmental factors that might influence them. You can also explore the unintended consequences of what you are doing, which would be hard to find out in any other way. You can also use these maps as visual models of change, which can help communication. They are, of course, also useful for refining what you do. This impact map or logic model approach is also the first stage of social return on investment. It is important, however, to bear in mind that these approaches are mostly linear. In other words, the causality runs from inputs to outputs to outcomes and to impacts. In reality, it is likely that there could be complex feedbacks between different elements and connections to other organizations and activities. A linear model is only a representation of what happens. You need to be flexible about thinking about how and what you do. Non-linear models, more complex ways of looking at how you create change, are in early development. For example, New Philanthropy Capital talks about impact networks. Here, different organizations combine together to create positive outcomes. This approach implies that any discussion of social value may not just be about recognizing the different outcomes and value an organization creates, but also what could be created by partnerships between organizations of different kinds. This is part of the fundamental shift that a focus on social value could give rise to. In other words, it enables a move from top-down decisions of what is to be done or valued to more collaboration over what is possible and how to achieve it. At least that is the theory. Another issue with the theory of change model is that it tends to focus on project or organizational impact and can sometimes ignore how the organization itself is structured, governed, and behaves. Some of these internal processes might end in themselves. Involvement of local people and beneficiaries in governance or contribute to the achievement of outcomes. Indicators for social value. Once you have got some idea of the range of different outcomes you aim to create, then you need to determine whether or not you are achieving them. Indicators are what the word implies, an indication that you are achieving your goal. They are not the goal itself, but only an approximation. It is very important to grasp this point. They can be quantitative, numerical, or qualitative about people's perceptions or experiences. An example of a quantitative indicator might be the number and type of qualifications gained by people attending a training center. An example of a qualitative indicator might be the change in confidence of those attending the center, whether it increased, decreased, or stayed the same. Some people also talk about SMART outcomes or indicators: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. There has been much work over the last few years to develop standardized indicators for the different kinds of outcomes that organizations might produce. This can be very useful since they have already been created for you, can be compared, and are recognized and credible. However, it is not always possible to use existing indicators. You may have to create your own, either for your organization or together with others doing similar things. Also bear in mind that every indicator or measure will have its limitations. You will need to think hard about what is best in the circumstances, or who else might be using similar techniques, so that you can share stories and create similar approaches. This is one area where you will need to discuss with your local intermediaries and public sector agencies the kinds of indicator that are seen as valid and useful in relation to social value. Sources of indicators. There are many different sources of information on specific indicators and broader frameworks for looking at groups of indicators. One useful summary is a source book on outcomes and indicators from the Charities Evaluation Service. There is also a sample indicator bank on the online Proving and Improving website from the New Economics Foundation. This website also sets out 20 quality and social impact frameworks which explore all systems for looking at overall organization quality and performance, as well as measurement and tools for planning. The website gives the benefits and limitations for the use of each one. The indicators mentioned there that could be useful are eco-mapping, looking at environmental impact from water use to waste; LM3, local multiplier 3, a useful tool for assessing how the money you spend works in the local economy and how to improve your impact; social impact measurement for local economics; social impact measurement for local economies; simple volunteering impact assessment toolkit. Outcome approaches all have their benefits and limits. Work by the Third Sector Research Center shows that there are different motivations for those taking on impact measurement, ranging from meeting funding requirements to marketing to gaining a competitive edge in bidding for contracts to motivating staff or for internal learning and improving. There are many questions of judgment, and there is also the potential for manipulation of what is measured, through what indicators are selected and how results are reported. The paper also notes that it is likely that external auditing of results might increasingly happen to ensure that verifiable processes are being used. This already happens in a few approaches, such as social audit, and helps to reduce any tendency to unduly claim for positive results. What does all this mean so far for smaller organizations? Few tips which might be useful to bear in mind. Start simply. It might be possible to work with similar organizations to share information and costs to create indicators or find the most appropriate approach. Ensure that what you are doing is proportionate to the size of the organization and to what you need to do. Use pro bono sources if you can, such as pro bono economics. You could try and ask funders to support some in-depth external evaluations by, for example, a university if you need this. In theory of change discussions, there might well be existing rigorous research which you could use to evidence the longer-term impacts. By doing this, you might then need only show progress towards these goals. It was also thought that possibilities in future could be Commissioners might usefully limit to a few, say 5 indicators in subsectors which could be compared. Smaller organizations could link with larger ones for mutual learning and benefit. Developing and existing tools and approaches for measuring social value. As noted above, value determination is not the same as outcome measurement. In other words, the outcomes you aim to deliver may not be valued equally or even at all by all stakeholders. Value is subjective, not objective, although much outcome measurement is also rough and involves choice. In other words, what is valued by one person is not necessarily valued similarly by another. There are therefore judgments to be made about what is relatively important. There seems to be consensus that these are best developed by talking to all available stakeholders so that fully informed decisions are made. However, the realities of commissioning what is valued by the public sector, although potentially and ideally developed in consultation with possible providers, will probably dominate. There is also no current agreement on how social value will be developed, measured, and reported around the country. The challenges for measuring and determining social value will be to find ways to show and evidence the different kinds of value created, as well as to compare different approaches and outcomes from different activities or organizations. With limited public resources, the impact of initiatives on available money will also be important. At present, organizations will need to think about how their organization creates different kinds of outcomes and how these relate to the kinds of things being currently discussed under social value. You can then work out how best to evidence and present your approach and results. The impact and power of the ideas of economic value. To understand where some of the current approaches have come from, it is useful to understand the currently most dominant way of thinking about value, which has been economic. What this simply means is that the interaction of demand for something and the provision of that service or output results in a price which is seen as a proxy for the value of that good or service. The extension of this way of thinking or the use of the price as a way to determine value has been used by governments around the world in order to determine different courses of action for particular policies or interventions. This approach lies behind forms of economic analysis used by governments such as cost-benefit analysis. Economic criteria also lie behind other ways of choosing between different options such as cost effectiveness. As in all outcome measurement, difficulties arise when you have outcomes which are hard to measure or put a monetary value on. For example, determining the value of a life saved or the benefits of a piece of woodland. Various measures and approaches have been used to approximate these. One of the most common approaches is that of willingness to pay. In other words, what would you be willing to pay for, say, preserving a piece of woodland? Revealed preferences is yet another approach which refers to behavior in action. For example, how much more or less people actually pay for a house in a particular locality because of such criteria as access to schools or open space. The implications, opportunities, and limitations of economic analysis and the limits and potential of economic ideas of value, as well as other ways of looking at value for voluntary organizations, charities, and social enterprises are set out in my 2 Third Sector Research Center papers on economic analysis and the third sector and value and the third sector. The papers argue that values in the third sector can also relate to beliefs or to the existence of something. Value can be created between individuals and be part of the processes, interactions, and structures of organizations which could be valued in and of themselves. The economic way of thinking has, however, influenced methods of talking about and measuring social value, partly as a way to gain credence, but also as a way to widen thinking within finance, business, and the public sector about how to use forms of investment and funding for maximum benefit. Other ways of looking at social value that combine monetary and non-monetary values. Another way of looking at social value which does not focus so much on the need to monetize everything was developed as part of the National Social Value Commissioning Project. The results are now available through the Northwest Social Value Foundation. They have created a set of tools and techniques that providers and commissioners can use across health and social care. The Social Value Toolkit has been designed to help you work out, if you are already delivering social value, how to encourage and capture through commissioning, and how to evaluate and measure. Another approach is that of the Center for Innovation in Health Management at the University of Leeds. They have developed a fair chance approach to social value, which they argue is unique because it requires that you determine social value impact, measure this value, assess your ability as an organization to use resources effectively, and make sense of evidence, all at the same time in recognition that social problems are not linear. Non-monetary approaches. Others are looking at approaches which only use non-monetary criteria. They believe that social worth cannot be calculated exclusively in the form of monetary value, so have developed this tool so that voluntary and community groups can demonstrate their social value. It focuses on the extent of an organization's impact in the following areas: local relationships with people and organizations, building social capital and social cohesion, contribution to the local economy, and environmental impact. From what has been set out above, it is currently impossible and undesirable to point out off-the-shelf social value tools or even determine the most likely approaches to measuring social value or even particular social outcomes or impacts. This situation therefore poses problems for local voluntary and community sector organizations who are trying to develop the best ways to articulate and prove their social value or wider community benefits, which might be relevant to securing contracts or being appropriately included within commissioning strategies. There is also the related issue of relative cost of using different approaches and the skills required. It is currently impossible and undesirable to point to off-the-shelf social value tools. It is also important to bear in mind that at a time of cuts, value in the sense of that which saves money down the line for different agencies or that which is prioritized by the public service will be key drivers. But the development of social value measurement will need to be brought about through dialogue and negotiation. These approaches, though, can also be challenging to your ways of doing things, since they begin to question and evidence your theory of change. In other words, how the resources and approaches that you use translate into positive results. They can also unearth the wider impacts, which can be positive or negative, of what you do. It could also enable you to work with others where appropriate to better meet shared objectives.